You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, still in New York City. I'm editor at large at The Diplomat and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Joining me today is a guest that we've previously had on the podcast, but somebody I'm really pleased to have back on the show. Today, we have Tobias Harris, a Japan analyst at Teneo, and more importantly, author of The Iconoclast, the newest biography and most timely biography, coincidentally, of outgoing Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who resigned at the end of August after a few weeks of rumors. And first of all, Tobias, I'm very glad to have you back on the show. Welcome back.
Really great to be with you, Ankit. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, and I really want to congratulate you on your recent biography, which has been reviewed extremely well. Full disclosure to listeners, I have not yet had the chance to read his book, but it is very much at the top of my list. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about when they can expect to receive your book if they're in the United States?
Sure. So it was actually supposed to start hitting booksellers in October, and given the extreme interest in the lifetime's legacy of Abe Shinzo, will start shipping to booksellers, I believe, imminently, and was also told that any day now the ebook will be available.
Terrific.
So just keep a lookout. It will be there soon.
Very good. And yeah, so I'm hoping to really pick your brain on a few issues today relating primarily to Abe Shinzo's legacy in Asian geopolitics. And there's a lot to cover here. And obviously, Abe has been a mainstay on this podcast in many conversations, certainly trade policy, TPP, CPTPP, the whole notion of the Indo-Pacific. I don't think it's too controversial to say that there's probably a good case to be made that we wouldn't be talking about the Indo-Pacific in the way that we do without a lot of the intellectual work that was happening in Japan. Really going back to Abe's first non-consecutive term as prime minister back in 2006, and his speech to the Indian parliament, and this notion of the confluence of the two seas in the Asia Pacific. But before I get ahead of myself, Tobias, I want to sort of ask you to kind of give us your elevator pitch for how you view Abe's legacy as a foreign policy prime minister in Japan. Obviously, longest-serving prime minister in Japan's post-war history. What's your assessment of how we'll come to remember his influence on Japan's role in Asia and the world?
Well, I think we can start by looking at a number, and I think it's a number that captures everything. And that is that in just under 8 years as prime minister, he took 81 foreign trips. And I believe the count for the number of countries he visited on those trips was something like 170. I mean, he was everywhere, was peripatetic, he wanted to be, to show physically that Japan was present in the world. Japan would show up, would make its voice heard, would come often with, money in hand, and, its companies would be there too if they weren't already there. And that was, I think, what was different in a way that was never really seen before. Having a government that was around for this long meant that from the very beginning they articulated a strategy and went about pursuing that. And Abe being present was a big part of realizing that strategy in the world. And that, I think, was a phenomenon from Japan that you've never really seen before. That consistency. The clear articulation of purpose, and then following through from the prime minister down. That really, I think, the tone was entirely different for his tenure.
Mm-hmm. And if there's a theme to Abe's, particularly his second term, he takes over again in 2012, a little over a year after Japan is still in the process of recovering from the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. And the theme was really that, Japan under Abe would be back. It would be back in many ways, economically, as a power, as an influential voice on the world stage, as a multilateral force for good. On all of those measures, how well do you think Abe fared? Maybe let's start by talking about trade, which I think is actually a very important part of a lot of what Abe had to contribute, certainly in the Asia Pacific and in processes like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and what eventually became the CPTPP. How do you assess Abe's performance on that front?
Sure. So it really, in some ways, is the most remarkable change that you saw from the Japanese government over the course of his tenure. That that Japan was not just going to be playing a defensive role or a supporting role, or sometimes an obstructionist role in trade negotiations. That from the first months in office, there was a commitment to Japan playing a constructive role in a regional multilateral trade agreement, even if it meant defying Abe's own base. And that really, I think, is the most important thing. It wasn't just that he did this, it was that he was elected with a big majority in December 2012. But to some extent, that majority rested on opposition to the outgoing Democratic Party of Japan's support for potentially joining negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There were a lot of farmers who actually in 2009 had crossed lines and had been willing to vote for the DPJ. And by 2012, they felt betrayed, and the LDP picked up on that, ran against it, and so you get this majority that, at least in part, has a lot of people who are anti-TPP. But by March of 2013, Abe felt that he got the reassurances from the Obama administration that he needed, that there would be certain carve-outs for Japanese agriculture, that he wouldn't have to make a number of commitments beforehand. And by March, Japan joins, and he says this has to be done. Japan has no choice, and of course, it's part of this broader strategy of recognizing that Japan has no alternative but to ensure that the U.S. is committed politically, military, and economically to the region. But really making that commitment, taking on domestic interest even within his own party, and then doing it over and over again as the TPP talks went on. And at various points in that process, you had people within the LDP try to derail the process. And he overcame that resistance, actually got a signed deal with the U.S. Japan at least was able to ratify it. And then in 2017, even more remarkably, you have Abe saying, well, without the U.S., TPP is meaningless, and so we're not going to invest in it. And U.S. pulls out, and a couple months later, Abe changes course, and Japan basically, I'm not going to say single-handedly, it did require help from other partners, but basically ended up as the leader of a revived TPP, the CPTPP, and bringing it back and bringing it to the finish line in this revised form. And particularly in a revised form that made it possible, I think, in a number of ways for the U.S. potentially to come back under maybe a different administration. And that took fighting within the group of the surviving 11 members. A remarkable progression from having to overcome resistance to within his own party just to join the talks, to Japan leading the talks back into reality from what seemed like oblivion, and then concluding a deal with the EU, articulating principles when it was hosting the G20, the Osaka track on data governance. Just Japan becoming confident, speaking on the importance of a rules-based multilateral trading order. That meant a remarkable transformation from where Japan had been in the not too distant past.
Yeah, I remember pretty vividly when Abe came to Washington in February 2017, right before his trip to Mar-a-Lago with President Trump, which was rudely interrupted by a North Korean missile launch. But I remember it actually jumped out to me because everybody was wondering how Abe, at the time Theresa May, how all of America's allies would manage an American president with whom they had serious philosophical disagreements on matters including trade and the rules-based order. And Abe held his own. I remember him, defending Japan's view of the value of a multilateral rules-based trading order while standing next to Donald Trump at the podium. And that I thought was remarkable. And I'm trying to kind of, steer the conversation now a little bit towards the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-Japan relationship under Abe. Obviously, it is Japan's most important diplomatic relationship. The cornerstone of Japanese defense strategy is the alliance with the United States. And Abe certainly, like many other U.S. allies, discovered this to be a difficult task. But, I bet if you would poll other American allies and you ask them about how Abe personally fared in managing the alliance under Trump, my thinking is that he would get a fairly good grade. What's your assessment of how Abe managed the Obama to Trump administration within the alliance context?
Yeah, Abe takes power. He's got this commitment. He wants. He knows that Japan really has no alternative to the U.S. being engaged in the region. Any alternative to that is considerably less attractive. And he's willing to invest first with with Obama, who was a leader, I think personality wise, they didn't gel very well. I think there were lots of people in the Obama administration who were not thrilled to see Abe come back, and feared that having this outspoken nationalist in Japan would upset a lot of the plans for the rebalance, and it would be a gift to China, and it would make life difficult with the South Koreans. And I think for the first year, certainly, at least until he goes to Yasukuni, I mean, I think that's true. And there's a lot of work that has to be done, just to get over the hump on some of the history issues. But I think post 2013, post that Yasukuni visit in December 2013, I think something actually fairly remarkable happened. I mean, I think you got a commitment on both sides, both governments, to really focus on the fact that they had tremendous shared strategic interests, and you really tried to not let some of these tricky history issues get in the way of pursuing those interests. And so, on the one hand, they really invest in security cooperation. I think you get in 2014, a pretty strong statement from Obama himself on the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty applying to the Senkakus. You have the revision of the guidelines for defense cooperation in 2015. On Abe's side, you have him spending quite a lot of political capital, first to change the interpretation of the Constitution to allow Japan to engage in collective self-defense in a way, so that Japan could actually contribute, at least in certain scenarios, to come to the aid of the U.S. military in the event of a crisis. Actually, even before that, Abe spent some political capital getting an upgraded law for state secrets that led to some pretty big protests, and also was welcomed by Washington, but required quite an expense. He basically had to use a good chunk of political capital that he had earned during his first year from doing Abenomics. And so you had a number of steps taken by both governments to shore up defense cooperation. You had in TPP negotiations, you basically had a bilateral FTA that solved a lot of the long-standing issues in U.S.-Japan trade negotiations, going back decades. So you got that done. You had, I think, Abe appreciated in Washington in ways, and I think symbolized by him, becoming the first prime minister to address a full joint session of Congress in 2015. And at the same time, you also, I think, had maybe somewhat unrecognized or under-recognized maybe, but an attempt maybe by both administrations to find a way to talk about history issues in Asia and historical memory without as much finger pointing, without an approach that got Japan got Abe, I should say, really to be specific, into a defensive crouch, where he feels the need that he has to show his independence by going to Yasukuni or doing these other gestures. And so on Abe's end, you get a statement on the 70th anniversary of the end of the war in 2015 that is pretty mild. I mean, I think compared to what people had expected, ended up being pretty inoffensive, and there were some retrospectives this year, and really, I mean, it's remarkable compared to what people had feared, just how just how he didn't really touch any of the hot button issues that I think people had worried about. And then in December of 2015, you got an agreement on the comfort women with South Korea that you get an apology from Abe, a new grant of money, not a perfect agreement, but I wrote at the time, if you think you're going to get a better deal from Abe, or I should say South Korea thought it was going to get a better deal from Abe, let alone a subsequent Japanese leader, if this deal somehow didn't stick. I think that would have been a mistaken impression on the part of the South Koreans, and they might be in a position to learn that now. Now that the Moon administration walked away from the 2015 agreement. But I mean, that was still a change of tone from Abe. You just didn't see the same kind of tendency to provoke on these issues as you saw earlier in his career. I mean, it just there wasn't as much pressing for new textbooks that emphasized a nationalist approach to history. It was just not how he addressed these issues, and I think it's actually a sign of how he grew in office, that he did recognize that there were bigger issues. There were that Japan's security in the region required maybe a more cold-blooded approach to the world that Japan was facing, and that he had to be willing to set some of these issues aside, whatever his personal thoughts. And I think this process with Obama was certainly a big part of that. So Obama goes to Hiroshima, Abe goes to Pearl Harbor. They're talking about historical memory and what happened in the past, but without being, without it being about apologies or blame or claiming responsibility. I mean, and I'm sure there, good reason to think that maybe a leader like Abe needs to go further, and to really have historical justice, you have to go further. But in a more practical sense, I mean, I think it still was a pretty remarkable achievement, certainly compared to Abe's first premiership, which ended which was marred by real tension between the U.S. and Japan over historical issues. So that was a pretty remarkable achievement. And then, of course, the Pearl Harbor visits, in Obama's kind of final weeks, and some of this symbolic peak of what they had achieved for the last few years. And then a few weeks later, you get a very different type of U.S. president.
That's right. That's right. Before we get to the Trump administration, since you, I think, walked us nicely into the history issues and the relationship with South Korea, I was wondering if I could get a little bit of your thoughts on recent events, specifically the fallout of the South Korean Supreme Court decision regarding wartime forced labor and the ensuing steps that the Japanese government took, and really the total collapse in Japan-South Korea relations. I think that has been very disappointing for a lot of folks in D.C. Particularly, I mean, I think one of the major accomplishments of the Obama administration, especially towards the end, was the ability to foment some kind of trilateral cooperation. Tony Blinken, as Deputy Secretary of State, met, I believe, a few times with his Korean and Japanese counterparts in a trilateral context. The first meeting between conservative South Korean President Park Geun-hye and Abe was under the auspices of the Nuclear Security Summit, with Obama really stewarding that process for the two of them. But now I think we're in a place where Japan-South Korea relations are, I think, at a noticeably, really, I mean, just like way lower than they had been throughout the entirety of Abe's administration, certainly. How do you assess the long-term ramifications of what's happened under Moon and Abe's final years? Do you think this will be something that just becomes a structural condition for Japan in the coming years and potentially even decades in Northeast Asia? Just this very difficult relationship with South Korea. How do you view the longer-term effects of this?
It's certainly one of the biggest, I think, black marks on his record, and I want to be clear what I mean by that. But I mean, there's no question as Abe leaves office that you look at. In 2018, he wins his third term, and he says he's going to settle the accounts of post-war diplomacy, and that in his mind did not refer to South Korea. But what we're seeing is it actually, what I think lots of Japanese considered settled in 1965, when you get the basic treaty and the resumption of relations, and Japan giving grants of money to help Korea develop and rebuild. That for South Koreans, that was not settled history. That was not, that the chapter had not, the book had not been closed on on what Japan, what they feel Japan owes South Korea. And so on the one hand, you can understand Japan's perspective. You sign a treaty, the treaty makes it very clear that monetary issues are settled by this. Japan did pay a not inconsiderable sum, money that did end up really helping to finance the industrialization of the South Korean economy under military governments. And from the Japanese perspective, a treaty is a treaty. We can't just say, well, you've changed, so therefore we're gonna rip up the treaty. And I think on the other hand, you can also understand the South Korean perspective that this was a treaty made under a military government, under a leader who had served in the Japanese military. And that South Korea wasn't democratic, it was poor, it certainly needed the money, and that if you're South Korean today and you're living in a country that has one of the great you're living in a country that's one of the great success stories of democratization and industrialization, and leads the world in so many ways. And I mean, certainly one lesson of the COVID-19 pandemic is just how well governed South Korea is, and that it really has a state that is flexible, that has learned from past incidents, whether it's an economic crisis or past public health crises. I mean, it's really shown itself to be well governed, and so South Korean, you realize, well, is it really fair that Japan was able to basically get away with a to use a term with a lot of baggage in Asian history, but with an unequal treaty, from a time where South Korea didn't have that much of a choice. And so you understand that people now in power in South Korea feel like that actually, that there is work on changing the terms of the relationship. And so you understand where the South Koreans come from. You understand why the Japanese say we have a treaty and we can't just throw that out. And so that's, there's not an easy way around that. And it certainly doesn't help that you have more conservative leaders like Abe in Japan who certainly are not eager to apologize. Who apologize more, who think that past Japanese leaders have apologized enough and given enough, and there's no need to do more. So it's really it is a sticky structural issue, and you realize that the work that people in the Obama administration put in, and to the list you mentioned, you also add the ambassadors who I think in both countries who did a lot of work as well. A lot of that is you're trying to make the best of a situation where you have two countries, two neighbors, two U.S. allies who, in a lot of ways, fundamentally view their relationship in different ways, and are don't necessarily look at each other and see potential allies. They see neighbors with with whom they've had very difficult past, and just looking at the other and thinking that the other party is not being fair in the relationship. It is not either in Japan's case, I think they think the South Koreans have not acknowledged the ways in which Japan has changed since 1945.
It's a rivalry.
And I don't necessarily, and I think certainly what we've seen over the last couple of years, with the fallout from the forced labor dispute, is that it's exposed. Beyond the issue itself, is that I think it's exposed the extent to which they don't necessarily even see their interests the same. There's not really the glue. They don't look at North Korea in the same way.
Right.
I think they compete economically in a number of different ways. I don't think they look at China the same ways. Of course, they're both U.S. allies, but that grouping them as U.S. allies can sometimes conceal more than it reveals in terms of how those alliances function, what they're aimed at, what their purposes are, and so it shows you that there's real danger that this is not a dispute that's just going to be that you can just paper over. That there are real there's real long-term drift, and I think you've seen. I think even before 2018, there were already signs that that corporate Japan was disengaging from South Korea, that it didn't see it as as important a market, and after if they have to worry about expropriation risk because of more of these lawsuits that that are in the pipeline, if they have to worry about boycotts, that it just looks like a less attractive place for Japanese business to be, and a less attractive place for Japanese tourists to go. Who knows what tourist patterns are going to look like after this year, but. There's a real danger, I think, of the two countries drifting apart. And Abe's place in this, clearly these issues are bigger than him, and they're bigger than Moon. This is about really the two peoples and kind of dominant tendencies within the two publics, and to some extent the leaders reflect that rather than create those conditions. So we can't just say if only Abe were different, or if Abe were replaced. Or if Moon were replaced, that things would be easier. I don't necessarily think that's true. I do wish that Abe had been a little more creative, and I think that's where that's where really he, he's at fault. That I think he opted for a course of basically he wanted an unconditional surrender on South Korea's part. He wanted. A diplomatic settlement that reinforced the '65 treaty.
Another loaded term from Asian history.
Yeah, no, you realize you're stepping on some pretty troubled kind of psychic terrain.
Right. I think, speaking of creativity, I'd love to talk more about the South Korea-Japan relationship, but we just got to move on to cover a few other issues, including, when it came to creativity, something I'll remember is Abe, like so many people in 2016, committed the diplomatic faux pas of, assuming that Hillary Clinton would win in the U.S. election. And of course, he finds himself. I was actually in Tokyo just, I believe, 2 days after the election in 2016. I flew to Tokyo and I was talking to folks, shell shocked in Kasumigaseki about the election result. And of course, Abe shows up in New York, golf club in tow, and begins his very interesting personal relationship with Donald Trump, which manifests a few months later at their Mar-a-Lago summit, among other things, and generally keeps the U.S.-Japan relationship on the right track, of course, with bumps in the road like any alliance. But I'm wondering how you see the ways in which Abe and the Abe cabinet have dealt with the Trump administration. A lot of American allies, there's sort of two models of how American alliances have coped with Trump being the bull in the china shop of continuity in American foreign policy. There's sort of the German model of standing up for values and interests in a way that might not please Washington, and the Japanese model, which I think some people would describe as a little bit too accommodating to Trump's whims at times. But it seems to have worked for Tokyo so far. I mean, there has been hedging behavior. Japan's been reassessing its own defense needs and policies. Of course, a lot of that is not due exclusively to Trump. There are other developments in the region, including North Korea, the modernization of the Chinese military. But what's your sort of 30,000-foot take on Abe's handling of Trump?
So, I think it actually in some ways starts with the public. I mean, I think, you look at a country like Germany and some other Western European democracies or Canada. I mean, I think there's an expectation in some ways that, that the leaders do stand up to Trump. They do stand up for democratic values and push back, when he questions the alliances or what the alliances have achieved or what, why they exist. I think, certainly polls say, I don't think the Japanese public necessarily likes Trump, but I also don't think they were expecting or would reward Abe for standing up to Trump in the way that some other leaders have. The expectation, pretty much always, from the public for Japanese prime ministers is, find a way to get along with the U.S. president. And if you can't do that, you pay the price. And just look at what happened to Hatoyama-san back in 2009, 2010. So you getting the U.S.-Japan relationship right is pretty much the first order of business, and so we should flag that for when we get around to Abe's successor. So most presidents have not had to do that under circumstances quite the same as Abe did after 2016. But I mean, the task was the same. I mean, the challenge was the same. And ultimately, I think the way you can look at the last few years is that whereas the first part of Abe's tenure, when he's dealing with Obama, you did see, I think a tremendously creative period, as we've discussed in the alliance, and finding new ways to deepen cooperation. And I think a lot of what's happened during the Trump years has been a little more defensive, preserving as much as you can of what had been achieved before, still pursuing this goal of making sure the U.S. is engaged politically, economically, militarily. I think at various times, I think Abe has tried to change Trump's mind, although over time it seems like he's done less of that, and it's more just, making sure that Japan's voice is heard from time to time, and that Trump looks favorably and calls Abe his friend. But I mean, it does seem a lot of what, certainly in the first year, I think a lot of what Abe did was trying to deflect U.S. demands for trade talks that would force Japan to make some tough concessions. Maybe figuring out if Japan could get away with reviving TPP even with the U.S. outside of it, and so basically that first year, I think Japan ended up being off the radar screen. I think there was more attention on other parts of the world and China, and so Japan, I think, was able to escape Trump's attention for that. And then it sort of gradually, I think, the focus shifted to Japan, and it became harder for Japan to escape. And once you get the threat of auto tariffs, for example, I think that's what got Japan to the table for a bilateral FTA finally, after the Abe government saying they wanted no part of it. So it's not that Abe entirely avoided negative developments in the relationship. I mean, I think things did happen that they would have preferred not to happen. I think they would have preferred the U.S. to stay in TPP and not have to deal with a bilateral FTA. I don't think Abe changed Trump's mind as far as his view of the alliance and viewing Japan and other U.S. allies as taking advantage of the United States. But I do think he managed, at least for the last better part of the last 4 years, to limit the damage that could do and at least keep up the appearances that there's no question about the U.S. commitment to Japan's security. I think it's created room for alliance managers to continue to work at the relationship at the working level and at the military to military level, and all of that has I think been important. And it's also worth mentioning also that I think as far as Tokyo is concerned, at least in certain parts of the Japanese government, I think they look at the Trump administration and its approach to China over the last several years, and I think they're thrilled. There was this essay in the American Interest earlier this year by an anonymous Japanese official talking about how pleased they were, with the hardline approach that you've seen from the Trump administration. I mean, we can talk some more about that essay if you want. I think it has some problems, but the point is, I think there are people in Tokyo who don't see Trump as a problem at all. I mean, maybe he's a little unpredictable, he's a little different than earlier U.S. presidents, but that there's plenty for them to like and plenty for them to be satisfied with.
Mm-hmm. So we're having this conversation on September 8th, and September 14th, we're looking forward to an LDP leadership election, and all the data right now points to a clear successor, a familiar name to anybody dealing with the Kante under Abe. Suga Yoshihide, the chief cabinet secretary for years, appears very likely to inherit the prime ministership in Japan. The reason I'm getting here, I know there's a lot more to talk about Abe's legacy, but just in the interest of time, Tobias, I do want us to talk a little bit about what we are likely to see. Obviously, the conditions under which Abe, sort of the short-term conditions are under which he resigned, obviously not sort of anticlimactic given everything else during his tenure. Obviously, his health issues became an obstacle that he could no longer ignore. And of course, 2020 has been a disappointing year for Japan, as it has been for so many countries around the world, but especially Japan, which had been looking forward to hosting the Olympics, which, again, if we go back to that theme of post-2012, Abe really being about Japan's rejuvenation and Japan coming back on the world stage, it is probably not the note on which Abe was looking to end his term. But in any case, tell us a little bit about the sort of the competition that we've seen play out at the highest levels of the LDP for the last few weeks, and what can we expect if indeed Suga does become the next Prime Minister of Japan?
So with a short 6-day race, the race is virtually won. I mean, Suga has virtually all of the LDP's factions behind him, 5 of the 7 major factions, and the last 2 are headed by his contenders in the race. So basically all the factions that were up for grabs are behind him. Most of the LDP members not in factions are behind him. He has soared in the polls after, I think, being considered an afterthought in the race. And so now he's the clear first choice, I think, of a majority of members of the LDP, and increasingly, I think, members of the general public look at him favorably as Abe's successor. So I think we can say pretty safely, something very big and unexpected would have to happen in the next 6 days for that to change, that we're going to see a Suga administration. Now, until very recently, a Suga administration seemed unlikely, and had Abe survived until the end of his term next year, I don't know if we would have seen a Suga administration. It does seem that he has, he's kind of stepping in as the relief pitcher, taking the ball and he's gonna pick it up. But I think the first thing to say about him is that people should not assume that he's just going to be a caretaker, that he's going to serve a year until Abe's term was supposed to end, and then the LDP will have another election, and there'll be generational change, and it'll be someone else. He's on the older side for a Japanese, or would be on the older side for a Japanese prime minister. He'll be 72 at the end of the year. So, that's older, older than Abe has been at the start of both of his premierships. You haven't had that many, remarkably enough, you haven't had that many septuagenarian Japanese prime ministers. But he's still, I think, young enough that he could serve at least a full term, and I don't think there'd be any question about his fitness to do that. And the thing I think that people are realizing and have realized over the last couple of weeks as he's emerged as the clear favorite is that he'd been sort of subsumed in this role as chief cabinet secretary, where very visible. I mean, he gives press conferences twice a day. Kind of the face of the government's policies in many ways. But his own personality and his own identity was kind of subsumed in the role, and he was kind of serving at the pleasure of the prime minister. And I think people are now realizing actually that he has a number of political assets that he brings to the table that make him a very formidable contender. In this race, and the way he basically cleared the field before the race really had even started. But also, I think there are going to be a number of qualities that he brings to the premiership that could make him, a very capable and certainly capable of surviving prime minister in a way that I think people had assumed would not. There's a tendency for long premierships in Japan to be followed by short-lived governments and a revolving door, and people have assumed that this would be the start of a new revolving door. I think it might be a little too premature to assume that this is a guy who is not a hereditary politician, unlike many people in the LDP, most notably Abe. He worked his way up politics, starting as a very lowly secretary. Was in local politics in Yokohama, worked his way into the Diet, and really made a career and became a cabinet minister within 10 years, which is a pretty remarkable achievement, all things considered. And he's got relationships across the LDP with the LDP's coalition partner Komeito. He knows how to use the bureaucracy, to command the bureaucracy. He's a master of personnel affairs and knowing how to get the right people in the right jobs and making sure that people are loyal and do the work that's required of them. He's legendary for having a diligent work ethic and being up and doing the work. And and the fact that he's not a hereditary politician, that he came from rural Akita Prefecture in northern Japan. Came to Tokyo like so many of his generation, went to school, then entered politics. He's got, I think, a way of maybe connecting with voters, and at least connecting with voters by speaking to their interests. And you look at his writings, you look at interviews with him. That he is laser focused on, pocketbook issues, the issues that the Japanese voters care about most. And throughout Abe's tenure, Suga was always there whispering in his ear, remember the economic issues that matter. Remember Abenomics. Don't forget, don't get too caught up in the Constitution. Don't get too caught up in foreign policy. You've got to remember what voters care about most. And he's going to bring that sensibility to the premiership. And I think at this point he's got an image of being maybe kind of a curmudgeonly old guy, and maybe sometimes in his press conferences he looks a little curt, but I think the Japanese people are going to get a new chance to meet him, and I think they've already been getting a chance to meet him, and he's going to bring all of this to the table. I mean, I think the one shortcoming maybe he has, and he's really trying to make the case that this isn't quite the shortcoming it seems, but that he's never been a foreign minister, he's never been a defense minister. Of course, as chief cabinet secretary, everything is on his agenda, and he is coordinating the government's response to pretty much everything, but he doesn't have the extensive diplomatic experience. He wasn't really traveling. He's not traveling with Abe. He's not really meeting face to face with leaders per se. Suga's trying to explain that he was involved in all the foreign policy making as well. But I think there's still going to be questions about that, and I think his choice to be foreign minister and defense minister and national security advisor, I think all of those choices will be closely watched to see how he's able to delegate and rely on others to kind of help him bolster that part of his portfolio. But I don't think we should go into a Suga premiership assuming that he's not going to last.
Makes sense. We'll definitely, I'll personally be looking forward to seeing how a Suga cabinet fills out. I think that'll be really something to watch, especially for folks interested in geopolitics and Japan's role. Tobias, unfortunately, I have some bad news, which is that we are out of time. I know that we could continue this conversation for much longer, but I will say for our listeners who have enjoyed this conversation, I am planning on picking up The Iconoclast as soon as I can get my hands on it, and you should too if you're interested in Abe Shinzo's legacy as a figure in Japanese politics, in Asian geopolitics, and in global affairs more broadly. So, Tobias, congratulations again on the book and for joining me today to offer up your analysis. Really hope to have you back on soon to talk about all things Japan again.
Thank you.
For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.